Good afternoon, Doc Rice. Good afternoon, teachers. So, I am Angel May L. Villegas, and I'm going to discuss to you about the qualitative research proposal. So, when you say qualitative research proposal, it is a well-written proposal that helps others to understand what is under study, why the study is important, how the inquiry will be conducted, and how the results will contribute to the body of knowledge. And it is also a document that describes the idea, importance, and methods of the research. So, qualitative research proposal is a process which discussed with regards to the most important questions that need to be answered in your research proposal with consideration of guidelines of being practical, being persuasive, making broader links, aiming for crystal clarity, and planning before you write. It is the researcher's step-by-step plan for discovering new knowledge. Here are the brief outline of recommended components in a qualitative proposal. First is introduction. Under it are purpose of the study, situating the self, initial guiding questions, and review of relevant literature. Second is research procedures. A. Site and selection of the sample. B. Role of the researcher. C. Data collection methods. And D. Ethical issues. Next is data analysis or presentation, which have data analysis strategies and validity and dependability issues. Fourth is importance or significance of the study. Fifth, time schedule and budget. Sixth, references. And seventh is appendices. And we are now at the first component of introduction, which is the purpose of the study. In introduction, it provides a clear statement of the purpose of the study, provide a sufficient background information so that the reader can understand the purpose of the study, and accompanied by an ambiguous definition of terms. So when thinking of the research proposal, it is a tool to sell the research to probably an ethics committee or a research funder, so you want to show them why your research is important to be done. So here's some prompting questions to help with writing the background of the purpose of the study. It might be, how much do we know about the problem? How would new things contribute to society or to clinical practice? Why is the research worth doing? And who might have an interest in the topic? So one might identify the research purpose or focus for a qualitative study from everyday practice and experience or from current social or political issues. Next is the situating the self. To discuss the purpose and background of the study, it should assess the researcher's own emotional involvement in the topic. The researcher should be interested and even passionate about the study. So one way to ensure that you consider this aspect is to include a section in the introduction that situates yourself in the study. For example, why are you interested in this topic? Or what personal background and knowledge do you bring to the study? Next is initial research questions. So it gives you research a clear focus, a guide on the design, research methodology, and data collection. So when you say initial research questions, it is an initial steps, means after you have an idea of what you want to study. The initial questions is the first active step in the research projects. So once the overall focus of the study has been identified, you are ready to state the central research questions and the sub-questions to be addressed. So qualitative research questions are typically about process of or understanding what happens, why or how something happens, how those involved understand the experience, and what it means to them. So these questions will help identify what to observe or what to ask in interview and direct the analysis, similar to how hypotheses in qualitative research direct the methodology. The fourth component of introduction is the review of related literature. So it aims of providing a foundation for interpreting results. So there are two key differences in the literature review in both quantitative and qualitative studies. First is in qualitative proposal, it is not assumed that the literature review is complete in the proposal. So it means that reviewing literature in a qualitative study is an ongoing process and involves an interactive process throughout the study. As the study evolves, new literature may need to be explored. Second is different kinds of information are considered appropriate to be included in the qualitative proposal. And we are now in the research procedures. So in this section, it describes the overall qualitative approach to be used in the study. You may need to include a rationale for the selection of the specific research genre. Will it be a case study, a narratology, ground theory, or an ethnographic study, or one of the other qualitative approaches? Under the research procedure is site and selection of the sample. Qualitative proposal should contain a complete description of the site you will choose and the rationale for choosing that site. So this section also provides information about the sample, the size, and the method of selecting the sample. So typically, samples in qualitative research are much smaller than those in quantitative research because there is no magic as to how many people you should recruit in qualitative research. It will depend on a number of variables and some considerations. There is need to balance the sample size of the amount of information we aim to get from the study. Although you may not know the exact number of individuals, cases, or documents you will eventually include in the study, you should approximate and explain how adjustments may be made as the study is underway. So next in research procedure is the role of the researcher. So the researcher will specify his or her role as an observer, a participant observer, or some combination of the two. So in this section, the researcher describes the procedure for gaining entry of the chosen site and how a relationship of trust will be established with participants. Third is the data collection methods. The researcher must describe the methods that will use to collect the data to answer each research questions. So here, the researcher must indicate whether they will use the observation, interviews, or documents because there are various methods and approaches to collect the data, but not all methods will be relevant to the questions. So collecting the data depends on the questions, the participants, and the time scale. For example, looking at the experiences of somebody who had severe trauma or exploring a sensitive topic, a one-on-one interview is probably the most appropriate method to respect privacy. Under the research procedure is the ethical and legal considerations. So it is a strict adherence to ethical standards in planning and conducting both qualitative and quantitative research is most important. Researchers have obligations both to their subjects and to the profession. The proposal should state how informed consent, confidentiality, and other ethical issues will be handled. The first obligation is to subjects. So when employing human subjects in research, the researchers must respect the subjects' right, dignity, privacy, and sensitivities. So there are 11 aspects of researchers' obligation to participants are identified in the American Educational Research Association standards in 1992. Number 1. Participants or the participants' guardians in the research study have the right to be informed about the likely risk involved in the research and of potential consequences for participants and to give their informed consent before participating in research. So it means that educational researchers should communicate the aims of the investigation as well as the possible to informants and participants and appropriate representative of institutions and keep them updated about the significant changes in the research program. Number 2. Informants and participants normally have the right to confidentiality, which ensures that the source of information will not be disclosed without the express permission of the informants. So this right should be respected when no clear understanding to the contrary has been reached. Researchers are responsible for taking appropriate precaution to protect the confidentiality of both participants and data to the full extent provided by law. Number 3. Honesty should characterize the relationship between researchers and participants and appropriate institutional representatives. Number 4. Educational researchers should be sensitive to any locally established institutional policies or guidelines for conducting research. Number 5. Participants have the right to withdraw from the study at any time. Number 6. Educational researchers should exercise caution to ensure that there is no exploitation for personal gain of research population or of institutional of research. So, the researchers should not use their influence over subordinates, students, or others to compel them to participate in the research. Number 7. Researchers have the responsibility to be mindful of cultural, religious, gender, and other significant differences within the research population in the planning, conducting, and reporting of the research. Number 8. Researchers should be carefully consider and minimize the use of research techniques that might have negative social consequences. Number 9. Educational researchers should be sensitive to the integrity of ongoing institutional activities and should alert appropriate institutional representatives of possible disturbances in such activities that might result from the conduct of the research. Number 10. Educational researchers should communicate their findings and practical significance of their research in clear, straightforward, and appropriate language to relevant research subject. And lastly, number 11, informants and participants have a right to remain anonymous. So it means that the right should be respected when no clear understanding to the contrary has been reached. So researchers are responsible for taking appropriate precaution to protect the confidentiality of both participants and the data. We are done in the obligation to subjects, and now we are here in the obligation to the profession. The researcher is also responsible to the consumer of research. Many research studies are published in journals, monographs, books, and other media, are referred to and used by professionals in the field. You are morally obligated to plan a study in such a way that the findings obtained would not result in offering misleading information. So it means that the researcher is obligated to report exactly and honestly what the findings were. Reporting research is a misleading way in a serious abuse of the researcher's responsibility to the profession. Next is the legal obligations. Researchers' obligation to human subjects are not only incorporated into the professional ethics statement of professional organizations such as ERA and the APA, but also have been incorporated into federal regulations. So prior to 1974, there were several infamous studies in which researchers placed subjects at definite risk in order to conduct their studies, wherein the federal government in 1974 passed legislation that applies to all research performed by or under the general supervision of institutions receiving federal research funds. The National Research Act of 1974 requires that to ensure protection of participants, all proposed research involving human subjects be reviewed and approved by an authorized board before the study begins. The Commission produced the Belmont Report in 1979, which identified 3 essential ethical principles that must be followed in all research with human subjects. So first ethical principle is protection of the human subjects from harm or protecting subjects from harm. For research that is funded by the Department of Health and Human Services and that involves human subjects outside the exempted categories, the federal regulations require a determination of whether the subjects will be placed at risk by the research procedures. If the researcher can demonstrate that the physical, mental, and social risks involved in the proposed project are no greater than those encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests, the subjects are no longer considered at risk. If the subjects are at risk, then the researcher must be able to argue that the value of the knowledge that is likely to be gained exceeds the potential harm. All subjects will be fully informed of the risk in the procedures, and appropriate medical or other support services will be available. So if these conditions are met, the IRB will usually approve the proposed work. The second essential ethical principle is obtaining informed consent, or the respect for subjects' right to know the nature and purpose of the study and their right to give or withhold consent to participate. Another stipulation of the National Research Act is that the researcher must obtain informed consent from research participants. So the consent should be voluntary, informed, given by a competent individual. Obtaining consent is more than simply having a potential research participant sign a form. So there are two purposes of an informed consent statement. First purpose is to enable potential research subjects to make an informed choice as to their participation in the study. And second, to document their decision to participate. So to make an informed choice, potential participants must understand the purpose of the study, the procedures, the risk and benefits of the project, as well as the obligation of both the participants and the researcher. In obtaining informed consent, it is documented by the use of a written consent form approved by the institution's IRB and signed by the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative. In some cases, it may be argued that prior knowledge of the purposes of the study would bias the results. Participants may change their normal behavior or they may respond in the way they think the researcher expects. Thus, the researcher sometimes does not tell participants the true purpose of the study, but instead use deceptions. So what are the two types of deceptions? First is passive deception, in which subjects are not told untruths but are simply not given sufficient information about the purpose of the study. Next type of deception is an active deception, in which subjects are deliberately given misinformation about the true purpose of the study, which means that the true purpose is completely different from what the researcher tells the subject. Ethical guidelines state that the deception must be justified in terms of benefits that outweighs the risk. It is still important to maintain the voluntary nature of participation, even if the purposes are not full of accurately presented prior to the procedures. So in cases in which it is important to use deception, the researcher must debrief the participants by giving a full explanation after the completion of the study. The third essential ethical principles of legal obligation is the right to privacy. So the respect for privacy is at the heart of the conduct of the ethical research with human participants. A piece of federal legislation called the Family Educational Rights and the Privacy Act of 1974, or also known as the Buckley Amendment. It was designed to protect the privacy of students' educational records. So it specifies that any data that identifies a student may not be made available unless written permission is obtained from the student or a parent or a guardian. So the consent specifies what data may be accessed, for what purposes, and by whom. and the participants in research must be protected from the risk that information they give during a study could be released to outsiders where it might have damaging the consequences. Under the right to privacy, there are two aspects of the privacy issue. They are the anonymity and confidentiality. First is anonymity. It refers to the process of protecting the identity of specific individuals. So it means that no identification is attached to the data obtained, not even the researcher knows who contributed the data. Second is confidentiality. It refers to the process of keeping the information obtained from an individual during a study secret and private. So there is broad professional agreement that all subjects have an inherent right to privacy. So if the researcher does not need to collect the individual's name and other identifying information, it is recommended that the information may not be collected. We are done with the research procedure, and now we are on the third components in a qualitative proposal, which is the data analysis. First is data analysis strategies. So, the qualitative researcher will collect a massive amount of data from the interviews, observation, and field notes. So, in the data analysis strategies, the researcher will need to tell how they will organize and analyze this data. And in the validity and dependability issues, this section should address issues related to the study's validity and dependability and discuss the strategies that will use to enhance credibility. The fourth component of the qualitative proposal is the significance of the study. The researcher will need to convince the reader that the proposed study is important. So the researcher will tell what can be learned as a result of the study and why that is worth knowing. The fifth component is the time, schedule, and budget. The researcher will need to estimate the time and cost involved in conducting the study. The qualitative research requires a great deal of time in the field and at least an equal amount of time for the data analysis. Here is the sample of the time schedule or the timeline. So most funders and organizations typically require a preset of timeline. Shown here is the sample of the budget and cost. It is advisable to propose all costs, justify this cost, and the source you need to calculate this cost. The second to the last component of the qualitative research proposal is the references. It is described as giving credit with citation to the source of information used in one's work. In addition, research is built up on that other people have previously done, thus referencing helps to relate your own work to previous work. And last is the appendices. It contains supplementary material that is not essential part of the text itself but which may be helpful in providing a more comprehensive understanding of the research problem, or it is information that is too cumbersome to be included in the body of the paper.